The documents had been sitting on my dining room table for 3 days before I finally picked up the phone and called my accountant. I want to explain how I got there, because if you'd told me 2 months ago that I'd be sitting in an office in downtown Calgary, watching my son-in-law's face go the color of old concrete while a lawyer read out numbers from a folder, I'd have told you that you had the wrong man. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a building code inspector for the city of Calgary. I know what it means to follow rules. I know what it means to do things by the book, and I know what it looks like when someone is trying to hide something in plain sight. My son-in-law had been hiding things for years. I just hadn't been looking closely enough. My name isn't important, but the story is. So let me start at the place where everything changed. Not the hospital. Not the meeting in my accountant's office, but the moment 3 weeks before any of it, when I found the email. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that. My daughter had asked me to print something from the shared family computer she'd left at my house during a visit over Thanksgiving. She'd forgotten to log out of her email. I was only looking for the attachment she mentioned, but the browser was open and the subject line in the inbox was visible without me doing a single thing. It said, Timeline for the Cloverdale property when he's ready to move. The Cloverdale property. That's my house. The house I've lived in for 22 years. The house her mother and I bought together before she passed. The house I refinished the basement of with my own hands. The house I have no intention of selling. I almost closed the tab. Almost. Instead, I read. I won't quote what was in that email, but I'll tell you this. My daughter and her husband had been in contact with a real estate agent since the previous spring. There were estimates. There were timelines. There were phrases like, once he's in assisted living and the market's good right now, we don't want to wait too long. I was 66 years old. I drove myself to the gym 3 mornings a week. I had no plans to go into assisted living. No one had spoken to me about any of this. I printed my daughter's attachment. I closed the browser. I went into the kitchen and stood at the sink for a long time, looking out at the yard. Then I called my accountant, a man named Bernard Fitch, who I've trusted for 15 years. Not because I was ready to do anything yet, but because I needed someone I trusted to know what I'd seen. That was a Tuesday in November. By the following Friday, I was in the hospital. The fall wasn't dramatic. That's the thing about accidents when you're past 60. They rarely are. I'd been coming down my back steps to get the recycling bins in from the alley. There'd been freezing rain the night before, and I hadn't salted that section of the steps. One foot went out, I grabbed the railing, and felt something in my left hip give out in a way I'd never felt before. I sat down on the bottom step in the cold and called 911 myself. I was calm about it. I'd always been calm in emergencies. 31 years of inspections will do that to you. The paramedics were good. The ER at Foothills Medical Center was busy, as it always is. By 9 that evening, I was in a room, diagnosed with a fractured hip and 2 cracked ribs from where I'd hit the corner of the step on the way down. The orthopedic surgeon explained that I'd need surgery the following morning, and that recovery would take several weeks. My daughter arrived at the hospital that night. So did her husband. I'll call him what I always called him, my son-in-law, though even typing that now feels strange, given everything that followed. He stood in the doorway of my room, with his jacket still on, like a man who was planning to leave in 5 minutes. He looked at me in the bed, looked at the tubes and the monitors, and the first thing he said was, "So what's the plan here?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I'm glad you called us." Not even just, "Dad." What's the plan? My daughter sat beside me and held my hand. She looked genuinely frightened, and I want to be fair. I believe that part was real. But her husband spent most of the visit standing near the window, scrolling through his phone, occasionally sighing in the way a person sighs when they're somewhere they don't want to be. When the nurse came in to check my vitals, he used it as an opportunity to step out into the hallway, and I heard him on the phone saying something about rescheduling, and it's not a great time. They left around 10:30. My daughter hugged me carefully, and said she'd be back in the morning. Her husband nodded from the doorway. The surgery went well. The surgeon told me afterward that the fracture had been clean and the repair was solid, that I'd be in the hospital 4 or 5 days, and that I'd need a walker for 6 to 8 weeks and physio after that. I thanked him. I asked the nurse if my family had been by. She said no. That was day 2. Day 3, my daughter called. She said she was sorry she hadn't come in, that something had come up with the kids. I told her it was fine. I've been telling people things were fine my whole life. It's a reflex. Day 4, nothing. Day 5, nothing. The man in the bed next to mine had his wife there every single day. She brought him a thermos of soup from home and sat in the chair beside him for hours, just keeping him company. I'm not a man who feels sorry for himself easily. I wasn't raised that way, and I've had enough real loss in my life to know the difference between loneliness and grief. But lying there on day 5, watching her tuck a blanket around his shoulders, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, something quieter. The recognition that I had been for a long time telling myself a story about my family that wasn't quite true. It was the nurse on my floor, a woman named Sandra Kowalski who had kind eyes and absolutely zero patience for nonsense, who said the thing I needed to hear. She'd come in to check on me late in the afternoon, and I'd just gotten off a short, unsatisfying call with my daughter, and I suppose something in my face gave me away. "Your family hasn't come in much," she said. It wasn't a question. "They're busy," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "You had major surgery 5 days ago," she said. And then she didn't say anything else, because she didn't have to. I lay there after she left and thought about the email. I thought about the words, "once he's ready to move, and the market's good right now." And I thought about Bernard Fitch, my accountant, who I'd called the week before the fall, who knew what I'd seen, who I'd asked to start looking quietly into a few things. I picked up my phone and sent him a message, "Still in the hospital. Ready to move forward when I'm out. Pull everything you can on the Whitmore Group." The Whitmore Group was my son-in-law's company. He'd started it 4 years earlier. Project management consulting, he said, though I could never get a clear answer about who his clients were or what exactly he managed. He'd asked me to invest twice. The first time, 2 years ago, I'd said no. The second time, 8 months ago, I'd said no again. But I'd also lent him $45,000 when he said they were having a cash flow problem and that my daughter was worried about the mortgage. That money had never come back. He'd signed a promissory note. I'd been waiting. Bernard called me the next morning. He had a man he used for sensitive financial research, a former CRA auditor named Clifford Roach, who now worked privately. Bernard had already had him do some preliminary digging, and what Clifford had found wasn't surprising. It was just worse than I'd expected. The Whitmore Group had 2 active clients, not the 15 my son-in-law had implied. The company's revenue for the previous year had been $83,000. They had a line of credit at the bank with $81,000 drawn on it. My son-in-law's personal credit cards had a combined balance of over $50,000. Their mortgage was 4 months behind. The $45,000 I'd lent him had been deposited into their joint account in March and was gone by June. Clifford couldn't tell exactly where it had gone. Not without a court order, but the pattern of withdrawals suggested a combination of credit card payments, cash, and several large transfers to an account he was still tracing. "There's something else," Bernard said. "Tell me, your daughter has been in contact with a financial advisor who specializes in estate planning. Not for herself. The questions she's been asking are specifically about how long probate takes in Alberta, and what the process is for selling a property that's been left in a will." I didn't say anything for a moment. "She's planning ahead," Bernard said carefully. "She's not necessarily planning anything wrong, but the timing, combined with the real estate correspondence you found." "I understand," I said. I lay in the hospital bed and looked at the ceiling. I thought about my daughter at 12 years old, making me a card when her mother was sick. I thought about her at her wedding, how she'd cried when I walked her down the aisle. I thought about all the times I'd said yes when I should have said no, because I thought that was what love looked like, clearing the way, smoothing things over, making sure she never had to struggle. I'd taught her the wrong thing. That was my fault. But I wasn't going to keep paying for it. I asked her if there was any chance she'd be willing to do me a small favor before I was discharged. She said, "What kind of favor?" I told her. She looked at me steadily for a moment. Then she said, "I've been a nurse for 23 years. I've seen a lot of families." She paused. "Leave it with me." I was discharged on a Monday morning. My hip was sore, but the surgery had gone as planned. The cracked ribs were the more irritating of the two injuries. Every breath reminded me they were there. I'd arranged for a medical transport to take me home, and Bernard had organized a home care worker to come in twice a day for the first week. I didn't ask my daughter or her husband for anything. Getting back into my house on Ridgecrest Drive felt like stepping into a room I'd almost lost. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and let myself feel the familiar weight of the place. 22 years of it. My wife's garden, visible through the back window, still put to bed from autumn, still hers in every way that mattered. I was not going to let anyone sell this house. Bernard came by that afternoon with Clifford's full report. We sat at the dining room table and went through it together. The full picture was methodical and cold. My son-in-law had used the $45,000 I'd lent him to make minimum payments on the line of credit and to fund a lifestyle. Dinners, a ski trip to Banff listed in his business records as a client retreat, 2 weekends in Vancouver logged as industry conferences. There had been no conferences. Clifford had checked. The client retreat had been attended by my son-in-law, my daughter, and their 2 children. There was more. A series of text messages obtained how I didn't ask, between my son-in-law and a friend of his, dating back 7 months. In one of them, he referred to me as the old liability and said that the plan was to get me into a smaller place by spring, sell Ridgecrest, and use the proceeds to clear their debts before Whitmore Group collapsed entirely. The old liability. I'd inspected buildings for 31 years. I'd cited owners for violations that put their tenants at risk. I'd written up companies for cutting corners on fire suppression systems. I'd done the job carefully and honestly, and I'd been fair, and I'd believed that fairness was something you passed down to the people you loved. "Bernard," I said, "tell me how to make this airtight." We spent 3 hours at that table. A new will, everything to the Alberta Children's Hospital Foundation and the Canadian Cancer Society. A living trust that a first-year law student couldn't find a crack in. A formal demand letter for the $45,000 with the promissory note attached, requiring the first payment of $3,000 within 30 days. And one more thing. A conversation I needed to have with a man named Gordon Ashcroft, who was a senior partner at the project management firm, where the Whitmore Group had recently applied for a subcontracting arrangement. I knew Gordon. We'd served together on a city committee 15 years ago. He was a straight shooter. When I called him and explained quietly and carefully what Clifford's report had found about the Whitmore Group's actual financials and my son-in-law's business practices, there was a long silence. "I wish you'd called me before we got this far," Gordon said. "So do I said. "I'll need to review this formally, but I can tell you that this subcontract is not going to proceed." That subcontract had been my son-in-law's Plan B. His Plan A was me. With both gone, the Whitmore Group had nothing left to hold on to. I asked Bernard to deliver the formal demand letter. I asked him to include a note, in my handwriting, that simply said, "Please come to Bernard's office, Thursday at 2 p.m. It's important. I didn't explain what it was about. I signed it Dad. Sintrak called me Tuesday evening from her personal phone. She'd seen my son-in-law at the hospital that afternoon. "He came to the nursing station," she said. "Asked about you." Not in a worried way. "He wanted to know if your things were still in the room and whether the discharge had been processed." She paused. "He called you a burden on the system." Those were his actual words, I said. "Thank you, Sandra, for everything." "Mr. Whitfield," she said. "That's my name, though it doesn't matter. Whatever you're planning, I hope it goes exactly the way it should. After we hung up, I sat in the dark kitchen for a while. My hip ached. The ribs complained every time I breathed. Outside, the November wind was moving through the spruce trees along the back fence, the sound I'd fallen asleep to for 2 decades. A burden on the system. My son-in-law, who hadn't come to see me once in 5 days, who had signed a note promising to repay $45,000 and had spent it on weekend ski trips, who had talked about selling my home like it was an asset on a balance sheet. I was done smoothing things over. Thursday came with 6 inches of fresh snow, the dry Alberta kind that squeaks under your boots. Bernard's office was on 8th Avenue. I arrived 15 minutes early with my walker and settled into the chair across from his desk. Bernard sat behind it, composed and quiet, a folder in front of him. Clifford Roach was there as well, in the corner, with his own folder. My daughter and her husband arrived together, 4 minutes late. My daughter looked pale and confused. She hadn't been told what the meeting was about, only that it was important and that I'd asked her to come. Her husband looked worse. He'd looked worse since the moment they'd received the demand letter, I was sure of it. He had the particular expression of a man who has been running calculations in his head for 2 days and doesn't like any of the answers. He saw Clifford and went still. "Please sit down," Bernard said. They sat. "Your father has asked me to facilitate this meeting," Bernard said to my daughter. "There are several matters we need to address." My son-in-law started to speak. Bernard held up one hand. "The first matter is the outstanding promissory note for $45,000 due from," and here he used my son-in-law's name, "to your father, dated March of this year. Per the terms of that note, a formal demand for repayment has been issued. The first installment of $3,000 is due within 30 days. My daughter looked at her husband. He didn't look back at her. "The second matter," Bernard continued, "relates to the Whitmore Group's recent application for a subcontract with Ashcroft Partners, which has been withdrawn following a financial review." My son-in-law's jaw tightened. "That's got nothing to do with." "The third matter," Bernard said without raising his voice, "is your father's estate plan, which he has revised." He slid a copy of the summary across the desk. "Everything is in trust. It's been structured to be uncontestable. His home is included. Everything goes to the charities he's designated." The room was quiet. My daughter was looking at me now. There were tears starting in her eyes, and I wanted to believe they were the right kind, the kind that come from recognizing something, from shame, from understanding. Maybe they were. I don't know yet. Her husband's face had gone the color of February ice. His hands were flat on his knees. He was staring at the summary page like a man reading his own verdict. "You did this," he said. "Not to Bernard, to me. You've been planning all of this while you were in the hospital." "I started planning it before I went to the hospital," I said. "The week before, when I found your emails to the real estate agent." My daughter made a sound. "You were planning to sell my house," I said, and I kept my voice level because I'd been keeping my voice level in difficult situations for 67 years. While I was living in it, while I was healthy, before anyone had asked me anything, before anyone had even pretended to have the conversation, you were in contact with an agent getting estimates. I looked at my son-in-law. "A burden on the system, that's what you called me." He started to say something about context, about how he hadn't meant. "The nurse remembered it," I said, word for word. More silence. My daughter said quietly, "Dad, I'm so sorry." And then she started crying properly, with her hands over her face. Her husband put his hand on her arm and she moved away from it, almost without seeming to realize she had. I looked at him. He was watching her pull away, and something moved across his face. Not remorse, not shame, but calculation. He was already thinking about what this meant for him. That told me everything I needed to know about the man she'd married. "The promissory note is a legal document," Bernard said, gently returning us to the facts. "We're prepared to discuss a reasonable repayment schedule, given the circumstances, but repayment is not optional." My son-in-law nodded slowly, like a man who's been told the building is already on fire. and there's no point arguing about the smoke detectors. Bernard walked them through the rest of it, calmly and thoroughly. When it was over, my son-in-law left first, quickly, without making eye contact with anyone. My daughter lingered. She stood in the doorway of Bernard's office with her coat half on, and she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since she was very young. Uncertain and a little lost. "I didn't think it was going to go this far," she said. "I know," I said. "That's the problem." She nodded slowly. She looked like she wanted to say something else and didn't know how. I understood that feeling. I'd been living inside it for years. "The house is mine," I said. "It's your mother's garden out back. I'm not leaving it." "I know, Dad, and I love you," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I love you. But I'm not going to keep pretending that what's been happening is acceptable, because it isn't, and we both know it." She didn't argue. She pulled her coat on all the way, and she left. I sat in Bernard's office for a few minutes after, watching the snow come down on 8th Avenue. Bernard asked if I was all right. I told him I thought I probably would be, in time. He poured us each a coffee, and we sat without talking, which is one of the great things about having an accountant you've trusted for 15 years. He knows when to be quiet. That evening I drove myself home, carefully, with the walker still in the back seat, and I sat in my kitchen and ate the soup my home care worker had left in the fridge. I looked out at the backyard. The garden was asleep under the snow. My wife had planted those lilacs along the fence 20 years ago. In spring they'd bloom again, the way they always did, stubborn and beautiful and entirely indifferent to whatever had happened over the winter. Some things were mine to keep. That was the clarity I'd been looking for, and it had taken a fractured hip and 5 days alone in a hospital and an email I almost didn't read to find it. My son-in-law began repayment the following month. The Whitmore Group quietly folded before Christmas. My daughter called me on a Sunday in December, and we talked for almost an hour. Not about any of it, just about ordinary things. Her kids, the weather, a show we'd both been watching. It was careful and a little fragile and completely real in a way our conversations hadn't been in years. Whether that becomes something solid again is not up to me alone. But, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't carrying the weight of a fiction I'd built around the two of us. I was just a man in his kitchen, with a cup of coffee, looking at a garden his wife had planted, in a house that was still and always going to be his. That was enough. That was more than enough.